and it's a gewaldige schus to enter into the Mea Chanukah mitzvah chavivi ad ma'od, and to spend the time learning these inyonim, which the inyone Chanukah, with the inyone Chanukah, which there's such a ribuy of Torah on the inyone Chanukah. So therefore, we're going to begin with this halacha, and at the end, maybe talk a little bit different things that derive and come out from this halacha. So, as I just picked up on some of the Hagdamah from my going to Shlomo Gaddis from Shlita, so we're just going to begin with this, the basic question about today's inyan. We know that the Rambam paskins in the beginning of Hilchos Chanuka. The Rambam tells us the Zman for Hadlokas Neres Chanukah. And the Zman for Hadlokas Neres Chanukah, the Rambam tells us is...
We're going to put the Rambam on the screen if you don't mind, okay?
The what?
We're going to put the Rambam on the screen that the Elm should be able to see it.
Okay, very well. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I didn't hear what you said. Okay. The Rambam Paskins in Perik Gimel, Hilchos Chanukah, and the Rambam Paskins Hadlokis ner Chanukah hi im shkiyoso loy me'achrin v'loy magdimin, that you light it with the shkia.
Perik Dalet.
It's where Perik Dalet? I don't remember yet. Okay, that's Perik Dalet. Okay, so the Rambam seems to paskin the halacha that the din is im shkiyoso, the bir agro and the minhoge agro and many other poskim, except that the Rambam means tchilas shkia. We know there are really two parts of shkia. Shkia is when the sun actually sets, that there's a tchilas hashkia, and there's also a soif shkia, which is tzeitz hakoychovim, when the tzeitz hakoychovim, when the koychovim come out. The haskoma of the roiv, the majority of the mafarshim of the Rambam accepted to mean that im shkia hainu is betchilas shkia, which I think the Rambam really derived it from the words of the Gemara, because the Gemara in Masechtas Shabbos does not tell us that Shkiyas Hacham, doesn't tell us that the Zman of Ner Chanukah is Laila. It tells us Mishet Tishka Hachama, when the sun sets. It doesn't even say Shkiyas Hachama, Mishet Tishka Hachama, when the sun sets. The Rambam learned that up to mean literally, at sunset is the time to light Ner Chanukah. We know those of us who are Oisik in Shulchan Aruch, the wording of the Shulchan Aruch in 99% of the times, the Mechaber agrees with the Shittas HaRambam. And very seldomly does the Mechaber choose to veer off and say his own opinion against the Rambam. However, here in Shulchan Aruch Siman Tov Reish Ayin Beis Sif Aleph, the Mechaber paskins and he says, Ein madlikin ner Chanukah koidim shetishka achamo elo im soif shkiyoso loy ma'achrin v'loy magdimin. That it seems that the Mechaber added an addendum to the Lashon HaRambam, and he said elo im soif shkiyoso. He uses the words of the Rambam ein madlikin koidim shetishka achamo, but he adds the words im soif shkiyoso, which would seem to point to the direction that the Zman for Hadlokas Ner Chanukah is Tzeitz HaKoychovim, which is Soif Shkia. That's the Tzeitz HaKoychovim. So that means over here, the Mechaber uncharacteristically is arguing on the Rambam. The Rambam holds that the Zman Hadlokas Ner Chanukah is Tishka Achamo, and the Zman of Hadlokas Neres, the Zman of is a Tchilas Shkia, and the Rambam and the Mechaber paskins that it's Soif Shkiyos. We'd have to understand, why did the Mechaber choose here to say Soif Shkiyos and argue on the Rambam? If the Rambam even has a hechrich slightly in the wording of the Gemara, because the Gemara says Mishet Tishka Achama, there must be a reason that the Mechaber chose to tell us that he argues and holds Soif Shkiyah, which parenthetically, this is a big machlokes in minhagim. Many people in Yerushalayim especially took on the minhag agro and they light Ner Chanukah b'tchila shkia, right at the time what we call shkia, sunset, the time of sunset. Mashaed came by Chassidim and by many other, most of Klal Yisrael. I don't want to get into the historical factors, but would hold that you light at Tzeitz HaKoychovim, depending what your Tzeitz HaKoychovim is. And from there flows many different menhogim when to light the Ner Chanukah. But the focus of the shir would be, why did the Mechaber choose to argue on the Shittas HaRambam? In order to be masba this inyan, I think we have to first begin with a different question. I'll pose the question this way. Someone lit Ner Chanukah like the Goyim, and he lit Ner Chanukah, let's say for argument's sake, today at 4:30. And he's not such a Meirich, and he doesn't do so many of the Mizmorim after the Ner Chanukah. At Shkia, he says the 3 brachas, and he lights the Ner. Right after, he sits down, washes, eats a sandwich, and within 5 minutes, he's ready to bench. So he's at 4:35, 5 minutes after Shkia. When he benches, does he say Al Hanisim of Chanukah or not? I would venture to say there's a very good reason to think he should not say Al Hanisim. Because if someone was born 5 minutes after Shkia, the haskama of 99% of Paiskim is the child's birthday and his time for bris is the prior day. So if a child would be born at 5 minutes after Shkia tonight, his bris would take place on Thursday, the following week. That means it's not Friday yet, and it's not the next day, because next day needs at least 12 minutes, needs Seitz HaKoychovim, or if not, it's Bein HaShmoshes. It might not even be Bein HaShmoshes. So it might be, it's Vaday Yoim. So it's Vaday Yoim the day before. So I would venture he would not say Al Hanisim because it isn't Chanukah yet. If it isn't Chanukah yet, then how could he say Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah? This evening, when we're lighting the menorah and we're saying Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah, if we're lighting according to the Rambam, so we're lighting B'tchila Shkia. So therefore, it's not even Chanukah yet. So doesn't that seem to be a paradox? We're lighting Neiros Chanukah, and it's not Chanukah. So if it's not Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah, it's not Chanukah. So therefore, if it's not Chanukah, so therefore the halacha would be, you would not say Al Hanisim. Okay, maybe I could tolerate not saying Al Hanisim, but how do I say Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah? I think that might have been a very strong reason that the Mechaber chose to say that Misha Tishka Hachama means Soif Shkia, because the Mechaber couldn't tolerate that we're going to light Neiros Chanukah preemptively. We're going to light Ner Chanukah before it's Chanukah. So therefore, the Mechaber chose, in this case, uncharacteristically, to argue on the Rambam and to say that the Zman of Ner Chanukah, Mishat Tishka Chama, means Soif Shkia, because at Soif Shkia, it's already the night of Chanukah, and therefore you could say Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah. But it seems that the Rambam would argue on that fact, and the Rambam would hold that the Rambam said that he held it didn't bother him, and he held that the halacha would be that you can light it earlier. But what's the rationale of the Rambam? If the Rambam should be bothered by this question of how can you say Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah? In order to address this question, I want to be magdim with another question. The Gemara on Daf Chof Aleph Amud Beis in Masechta Shabbos tells us the source of the whole yontif of Chanukah. And the Gemara tells us they came in after winning the war against the Yavonim, and they didn't find any shemen, and it says, Mipnei Zeh, because of what happened, Motzu v'loy porno shel shemen shu munach b'chais mishal kohen gadol, v'loy hoye boy elo lahadlik yoim echad, nase boy neis, v'idliku shmoyne yomim. And therefore the halal, that's what happened. So the Gemara, Lishona acheres, kavu v'osum yomtiv Yomim Tovim B'Halal V'Hoidoah. And that's the takon of Chanukah that we have, that they made the Yontif B'Halal V'Hoidoah. Rashi explains, what do the words Halal V'Hoidoah mean? Rashi says, Halal, Ligmar es Halal Shmoyne Yomim, and Hoidoah, Zok Rashi, Loimar al Hanisim B'Hoidoah. So Rashi seems to define the words of what do the words Halal V'Hoidoah. Halal is Gmiras Halal, and Hoidoah is saying al Hanisim. I really once asked a question on this Rashi, and it's really a question on the Gemara. If one would ask somebody, what's the motif? What is the marquee point of Chanukah? Ask any child, what is the main thing we do on Chanukah? I mean, besides eating latkes. But what else is the main thing we do on Chanukah? Would one say being goymer es halal and saying al hanisim? I would say being madlik the menorah 8 days. That's the symbol of Chanukah. How could the Gemara say kavu va'asu yontif b'halal v'hoidah, and this glaring omission of not saying about Chanukah? Ner is Chanukah. Well, Rashi leaves it out. Haloi dovaru. What's the pshat? It's not a kasha on Rashi, it's a kasha on the Gemara. And the truth be it is that the Rambam in Hilchos Chanukah, the Rambam tells us, Mipnei zeh, he quotes this Gemara, he paraphrases this Gemara. Mipnei zeh hiskinu chachomim shebeoisei hador sheyiu shmoinis yomim elu shetchiloson chaf hei kislev yomim toivim b'halel v'hoidah ligmar es halel, and zog the Rambam the lehadlik neiros shmoine yomim, to light the neiros for these 8 days. The Rambam is quoting the Gemara, and the Rambam adds into the Gemara shmoine yom, the lighting the ner Chanukah. The Rambam leaves out al hanisim, which we'll notice in a second. We'll note in a second. But the Rambam, which I understand, adds the words into the Gemara when he's quoting, paraphrasing the Gemara. He adds the din of lahadlik neiros. That is the din. Rashi leaves it out, and the Rambam somehow read it into the Gemara. I'll just tell you parenthetically that the end of Hilchos Chanukah, the Rambam calls hadlokas neiros ohidoah. The Rambam says mitzvahs ner Chanukah chaviva hi ad ma'oid, and the Rambam tells us it's chaviva ad ma'oid because it's lohidia ulahoidois la Hashem. By lighting the ner Chanukah, you're doing an act of hoidoah. That's what the Rambam says at the end of Hilchos Chanukah. So therefore, the Rambam held the words of the Gemara, hoidoah, really mean hadlokas ner Chanukah. And also we could add, the Rambam never brings al hanisim in Hilchos Chanukah. The Rambam only brings al hanisim in Hilchos Tefillah. The Rambam doesn't even bring al hanisim. Rashi made such a halacha of al hanisim into such a strong halacha that the Rashi says that was part of the takona. The Rambam holds on that was not part of the takona. It's like every yontif, you have to be masker the yontif. What it means, bahal v'hoidoah, means lighting ner Chanukah. So the Rambam learned the Gemara, mipnei zeh eskinu chachamim sheboisa ador, to be koivea yontif of Chanukah, to be goymer sahalel, and to light ner Chanukah. Mashen ke Rashi leaves out. So the question is on Rashi. How could Rashi have such a glaring omission to leave out the main identity of Chanukah and leave out the Neres Chanukah? So we began with a question of why the Rambam, the Mechaber argues on the Rambam, and he says it means Soif Shkia, and at the same time we're asking the question. So we said that because the Mechaber had to learn that the halacha would be, it would be impossible to light B'tchila Shkia because it isn't Chanukah. And then we asked now this question on Rashi, that Rashi himself says it's not part of the Iker Takona. What's pshat that Rashi leaves out the Takona of Neres Chanukah, and the Rambam finds it fit to add the halacha of Neres Chanukah, and that's the way he learns the Gemara of Hoidoah. The Gemara in Masechtas Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis tells us there was a big thing which we're not so familiar with and we're not cognizant of which was called the Megillus Tainus. There was something besides the Gemara, which was called a Megillah, besides Brises and Mishnahs, which was called a Megillus Tainus. There were certain days you weren't allowed to have hesped, you weren't allowed to have tainus, or certain days you have to have tainus and have a hesped. There's a Sugis HaGemara that Megillus Tainus became Batla. For some reason, the Chachamim found fit to say that in the latter generations, they didn't have to keep the Megillus Tainus. The Gemara then wants to make a proof. Is there Megillus Tainus, or is there not Batla Megillus Tainus? The Gemara at the bottom of Yud Chesam at Beis wants to prove that it was Batla the Megillus Tainus. So the Gemara, how do we know that it was Batla Megillus Tainus? Because one time there was a time of Chanukah, and the Chachamim were geyser a tainus on Chanukah. Now, Chanukah, they were geyser tainus. At the time of the Chazal, when they were geyser tainus, it wasn't only about eating and drinking. All the inuyim were prohibited on a tainus. So therefore, when they made a tainus, it was aser berachitza. Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Yeshua were very averse to the Chachamim making a tainus, being kaveya tainus on Chanukah. So they publicly went out and announced and showed people that they went to the Beis HaMerchatz in order to say, to show and underline that you're not allowed to fast and be kaveya tainus on Chanukah. Zog the Gemara, why can't you fast on Chanukah? Because it's Megillus Tainus. The whole yontif of Chanukah is not really in the Mishnah. It's not really in the Torah, obviously. So obviously it's part of this Megillus Tainus. And we still find that Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Yeshua decided to go against this Tainus that the Chacham were kaveya. So it seems they held Megillus Tainus loy batla. So the Gemara gives an answer. And the Gemara says, Shani Chanukah. Chanukah has a very strong underlying factor, and therefore, Pisuminisa, and therefore, a mess happened, and therefore, we don't want to play around with Chanukah. We don't want to chepa. We don't want to touch Chanukah. So the Gemara, so maybe Megillus Tainus was bottled, but Chanukah was not bottled. Frag Tosfos a gewaltige kasha. You know, contrary to the fact that we all learned in Cheder, that Chanukah is not in the Mishnah. Chanukah is found on numerous occasions in the Mishnah. And in Masechtas Rosh Hashanah itself, it's found. Because we know in the times when they used to be Kaveya the Chodesh al Yedei Riyah, they would do a Chodesh al Yedei Riyah, and they would have to send out Shluchim so everyone should know what day was Rish Chodesh. So in order to know what day was Rish Chodesh, they would send out Shluchim. But they would only send out Shluchim when it was pertinent to know for a Yontif. So they sent them out in Chodesh Nisan, they sent it out in Chodesh Sivan, they sent it out in Chodesh Av, and they also sent it out in Chodesh Kislev. And the Mishnah says, why did they send it out in Chodesh Kislev? Mipnei HaChanukah, that people should know when Chof Hei Kislev is. And since they should know when Chof Hei Kislev is, that's why we sent out the Shluchim. For Tosfos, I don't need a Maisa with Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Yeshua. It's a Beferish Mishnah. The Mishnah says there's a Yontiv of Chanukah. If you tell me that Megillus Tainus is going to be bottled, so Imkain, if Megillus Tainus is bottled, so then they shouldn't be a Chanukah. Obviously, at the time of the Mishnah of Rebbe Lezer, Rebbe Yeshua, there was Chanukah. So why does the Gemara have to bring such a backhanded raya? That Rebbe Lezer, Rebbe Yeshua went out to the Merchatz in order to publicly proclaim that there is Chanukah. It's a Beferish Mishnah, there's Chanukah. So that should be the Gemara's raya, that Megillus Tainus is not bottled. And then the Gemara would have to say Shani Chanukah. Why did the Gemara bring a straight out Mishnah in the second parak of Masechtas Rosh Hashanah, that the Shluchim went out on Chanukah? A gewaltige kasha of Tosfos. And for Tosfos, no. Chanukah could have been bottled. Chanukah would have been bottled. There would have been no inyan of the Yontiv of Chanukah. But you know what there would be? There would still be Hadlokas Neris Chanukah. Because the Ness of the Menorah in the Beis HaMikdash took place Chaf Hei Kislev. The Gemara is addressing the Yontif of Chanukah. The Yontif of Chanukah might have been bottled. That we have no raya in the Mishnah. Even if the Yontif of Chanukah would have been bottled, but we still would have lit Neris Chanukah. Neris Chanukah are independent and distinct from the yontiv of Chanukah as a place. So therefore, the Mishnah would have said the shluchim have to go out because there's a mitzvah to light Ner Chanukah. But still, the halacha would be that the hadlok of Ner Chanukah would still take place for these 8 days. Why would they take place for the 8 days? Because Chafei Kislev, and that's happened. Das heißt, as Taisus is being machadish, a gewaldige Zach, a gewaldige thing. Taisus is telling us that the hadlokas Neres Chanukah have nothing to do with the yontiv of Chanukah. Hadlokas Neres Chanukah have to do with the calendar date of Chafei Kislev, 8 days. The Rashba often argues on Taisus. And the Rashba says, if Chanukah would be bottled, the Neris would be bottled. How do you disattach the two things? If there wouldn't be a Megillus Tainis, so there wouldn't be a Yontiv of Chanukah. If there wouldn't be a Yontiv of Chanukah, there would be no Hadlokas Neris. Zok the Rashba, he can't tolerate Taisus teretz, and he says his own teretz to Taisus Kasha. Why the Gemara found it fit to bring this raya. But the Rashba principally argues on Taisus, and he says it can't be that the reason that that there would have been shluchim yaitzim is for Ner Chanukah, even if the yontiv of Chanukah would have been bottled, would have been banished, or not, would have been somehow timed out, clocked out. There would still be a mitzvah of lighting Ner Chanukah. Frek the Rashba wouldn't be true. V'hanira, it's a gewaldige machlokes. Is hadlokas Neres Chanukah part and parcel of the yontiv of Chanukah? That's going to be the Shitas HaRashba. Shitas HaTosfos, which I have the Yukim, I don't want to go into it right now, that Rashi agrees with Tosfos and Masechtas Rosh Hashanah Daf Ches. So Rashi Tosfos would learn that it's not part of the Yontiv. It's not part of the Yontiv. There's the Yontiv of Chanukah, and there's also the Yontiv of Chanukah, and then there's also separate and distinct, independent Adlokas Neres Chanukah. Im Kain. That's really Rashi Lishitos in Masechtas Shabbos. Rashi in Masechtas Shabbos says, Kavu va'asu yontiv b'halal v'hoidoeh. So Rashi, I'm specifically and purposefully leaving out the halacha of Hadlokas Ner Chanukah. The Gemara Masechtas Shabbos is talking about the yontiv of Chanukah. The yontiv of Chanukah is halal v'hoidoeh. Halal shmeina yomim, and hoidah ala nisim that you have to say b'tefillah. However, Neiros has nothing to do with the yontiv. Neiros is a halacha that is independent of the yontiv. It has a halacha of Chafei Kislev. The Rambam is going to hold like the Rashba, and the Rambam is going to hold that the halacha is that the Hadlokas Neres Chanukah are part of the yontiv. Or if Hadlokas Neres Chanukah are part of the yontiv, the Rambam had to read it into the Gemara. That when the Gemara says Haidoeh, so part of the yontiv of Chanukah is Hadlokas Neres Chanukah. This is a very important perception and way to look to perceive the Hadlokas Neres Chanukah and the yontiv of Chanukah, which maybe we'll talk with Derech Drush later. But is the Hadlokas Neres Chanukah for the ness of the menorah that happened to Beis Hamikdash, and it's not part of the yontiv? It's a separate halacha that took place Chafei Kislev, and we're commemorating it with Hadlokas Ner Chanukah. Or is it a halacha that's part and parcel of the yontiv itself, and just like there's an Issa Tainis, there's an Issa Hesped, there's a din Halel, there's a din Haidoeh, there's a din of Hadlokas Neres Chanukah. So that would be the machlokes, the Rambam, and Rashi and Tosfos. Im Kain, I want to go off now for 1 second about a Shailul Halacha. I once had in my shul a boy who got bar mitzvah, and it was a boy who really was looking forward to daven for the Yomid and to lane. That was his nature. And the boy bayom of his bar mitzvah was, let's for argument's sake say, it was Chav Sivan. So it was Chav Sivan, the family got together, and it was boy bayom Shabbos. So they all came to shul, and we were making an early Shabbos in the shul. The bacher came over to me, and he was all excited. He was going to daven for the Yomid Ma'ariv. I said, I'm not so sure if you should do that, because we're making an early Shabbos, and your bar mitzvah is Chav Kislev, and it's not going to be Chav Kislev until Tzeit Zakoi Chavim. But now we're way before Tzeit Zakoi Chavim. So you're a cotton. So if you're a cotton, I don't know if you're allowed to daven Ma'ariv for the Yom. The Bacha was a Lamdisha Bacha. And the Bar Mitzvah Bacha said to me, he said, I don't understand what the Rav is saying. I'm getting Bar Mitzvah Shabbos, Chav Sivan. We were Makabel Shabbos early, so now it's Shabbos. So it's Chav Sivan. If it's Chav Sivan, I'm Bar Mitzvah. How could you separate the two things? I said, you're a very Lamdish Bacha, but I want to tell you something. There's a halacha of making an early Shabbos. You could take the Kedusha of Shabbos and you could make it early. However, that's true. So when I make Shabbos early, even though it's not night yet, but I can make Shabbos early because I can elongate the Kedusha of Shabbos. But there's one thing I can't do. You know what I can't do? I can't move the calendar. I could create Kedusha, but I cannot move the calendar. So even though you're being Makabel Shabbos early, it's still not Chav Sivan until it becomes Vadai Laila. It only becomes Vadai Laila when it becomes Vadai Laila. Vadai Laila, it's Vadai Laila according to Vadai Laila only when it's not Laila, it's Chav Sivan only when it becomes Laila. However, it is not, it's Shabbos. So you could make a dissection. When you Makabel Shabbos early, you're bringing upon yourself the Shabbos, but you're not bringing Laila upon yourself. So now let's go back to our Inyan. Let's accept for a fact that you could be Makabel Chanukah early. Let's accept that. There is such a thing as Tosefes Chanukah. Just like there's Tosefes Yontif, there's Tosefes Shabbos, there's Tosefes Tisha B'Av, there's Tosefes Chanukah. So one would go, and before the Zman Laila that comes into Chanukah, you're Makabel on yourself Chanukah. I'll agree, it's the Yontif of Chanukah. But is it Chav Hey Kislev? No, it's Chav Dalit Kislev, and I brought upon myself the Kedusha of Chanukah. So it's the Yontif of Chanukah without Chav Hey Kislev. Im Kain, is this gewaltig in der Welt? According to the Shittas, that Chanukah, the Hadlokas Neris Chanukah, are totally in the Yontif. So when I make Chanukah early, Lu Yitzur, it would still be a Zman for Hadlokas Neris Chanukah. Because Hadlokas Neris Chanukah, according to the Rambam, is a din in the Yontif. So if I make the Yontif early, so I can, fact, make the Hadlokas Neris Chanukah early, because Hadlokas Neris Chanukah are a part of the Kedushas Yontif. If it's part of the Kedushas Yontif, so then I could make Hadlokas Neris Chanukah. However, if you learn like Rashi and Tosfos, Chanukah of the Yontif and from the perspective of the Neris are two separate things. The Yontif is Yontif of Chanukah, for Halal, the Issa Hesped V'Tainis, etc. But for Hadlokas Neris, Tosfos says that even if there would be no Yontif of Chanukah, there would be Halacha of Hadlokas Neris. That seems very clear that the Hadlok of Hadlokas Neris are Halach in Chafei Kislev. Chafei Kislev cannot be Chafei Kislev until it's Vadai Laila. So according to Tosfos, you would not be able to make it as man for Hadlokas Neris Chanukah. According to Tosfos and Rashi, you would not be able to. According to the Rambam, you would. That is the Machlokes, the Mechaber and the Rambam. The Rambam said it was baked into Chanukah, Misha Tishka Achama. It's not Laila. It's not Laila, and it's not Chafei Kislev until it's Vadai Laila. But I could do it Misha Tishka Achama, because when I do it Misha Tishka Achama, it was baked into Chanukah that you should make an early Chanukah. And therefore, when you make Chanukah, you make an early Chanukah. That was part of the Takona, that every Yid lights Chanukah licht the first night, Misha Tishka Achama. And when you light it, Misha Tishka Achama, it's as if you're inviting the Chanukah early. And therefore, it's a Zman of Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah. However, according to the Mechaber understood like Rashi and Tosfos. He understood that the halacha of Neris Chanukah are not tied to the halacha of the yontif. So therefore, it's true, it's yontif. If I would be makabel yontif early, but I would not be able to. It would not be able to light it earlier. So if I wouldn't be able to light it earlier, therefore I would not be able to. Therefore, the mechaber was compelled to learn the halacha that it takes place. Tishka chama means seif shkia, and that would be the machlekes, the Rambam and the mechaber. Before I get to exactly how this works out with Plag HaMincha, I want to say too, just to put a little geschmack in the lashon of the Rambam. The lashon of the Rambam, I don't have my Rambams here, but the lashon of the Rambam is, if you could put up that Rambam again, the first Rambam in Perek Dalet of the Rambam. The Perek Dalet of the Rambam tells us, Mipnei zeh eskinu chachomim sheba'osei hadoer, she'yeh shmoinas yomim elu, she'yeh shmoinas yomim elu, shetchiloson chofei kislev, shetchiloson chofei kislev. So the Rambam is what we call Chanukah in the lashon of the Rambam. Oh, if you don't have it, I'll be able to bring it. No, it's Zmanim and Noshim, that Rambam. So therefore, let me see if I can see it in the Rambam again. It's the one before, one page before. Here, I'll read it from my Rambam. I'll tell you which halach. It's just, I don't know if put the time in. The Rambam tells us that Mipnei zeh eskinu chachomim sheba'osei hador she'yiyu shmoynes Perek Gimel mei Hilchos Chanukah halacha Gimel. Mipnei zeh eskinu chachom sheba'osei hador she'yiyu shmoynes yom elu shetchiloson chofei bekislev yemei simcha v'hala. That's the lashon of the Rambam. If you look in the Shapsi Frankel Rambam, they add one word. Our Rambam says shetchiloson chofei bekislev. In the Shapsi Frankel Rambam says shetchiloson meleil chofei bekislev. They add the words mileil. I would think that seems to be very superfluous. Why would the Rambam have to say leil? Every Jewish calendar date begins at night. So why would we need it? Why would we need it to say mileil? I would remain with our gears of the Rambam. That's shetchiloson chofei bekislev. Why would the Rambam add that little word mileil chofei bekislev? I think the Rambam is telling us exactly what he's saying, what we were saying. The Rambam is telling us, really, chofei kislev doesn't begin until seif shkia. They made a takana to start chofei kislev earlier, and that's what was the takana. Therefore, the Rambam says, mileil, from the eve of chofei kislev. As we're entering chofei kislev, there's a halacha to light the menorah. Therefore, it's not really chofei kislev yet. We're pre-chofei kislev, but we make it into an early Chanukah, and that's why the Rambam, according to the old girsoyas of the Rambam, had the girsa of Meleil chofei kislev. So it just comes out something very interesting. According to Rashi, if somebody, and Tosfos, if somebody lights from Plag HaMincha, according to Rashi, it's not Chanukah yet. All it is you have a right to pre-Chanukah. There's a special halacha. You could do things from Plag HaMincha which will help for later. According to the Rambam, when you light Ner Chanukah, it becomes Chanukah. According to Rashi, when you light Chanukah licht, if it's not chofei kislev, it's not Chanukah. So therefore, there's some sort of maybe mechanism you could light earlier. However, according to the Rambam, by lighting Ner Chanukah, you in fact are makabel on yourself Yontiv of Chanukah. According to the Rambam, if you lit at Shkia and immediately went and ate a sandwich and then benched, you would say Al Hanisim. Because the reason you would say Al Hanisim is because you ate it on the Yontiv of Chanukah. However, according to Rashi, Rashi says it's true you lit it early, but it's not Chanukah. Because Chanukah, just because you're lighting a Ner Chanukah, doesn't mean you are makabel Chanukah on yourself. That's true according to Rashi. If you proactively went and decided to light a Ner Chanukah, then the halacha would, you to be makabel the Yom Tov of Chanukah, it would be in fact Chanukah, and you would be able to say a al hanisim. So that's what comes out in this part of the shir, that the halacha would be Ner Chanukah, according to the Rambam, is part and parcel of the Yom Tov. According to Rashi and Tosfos, it would not be part of the Yom Tov. I just want to take a 2-minute sidebar, and then we're going to go to something else. According to the Rambam, according to Rashi, Rashi says there was a takona. I'll begin this way to make an introduction. Those of us who learned in Yeshivas Lakewood, or even those of us who didn't learn in Yeshivas Lakewood, but definitely take very seriously every minig of Yeshivas Lakewood. In Lakewood Yeshiva, every mincha during the week is called a Hilchos Shmona Esrei. In the Beis Medrash of Beis Medrash Gavoya, they daven Shmona Esrei just till Kedusha, and there's no Chazaras Hashatz. That's for a separate shir. We're going to leave for Avgadas and Shlita to explain why that would be the halacha, why they do it that way. I think the Makar is in Slabotka, possibly Volozhin, that's the way they did it. On Chanukah, I think it's 2 or 3 times of the week of Chanukah is an exception to that minig. They say al-hani, they do the whole Chazaras Hashatz. And the reason they do this full Chazaras Hashatz is in order to say al-hanisim b'Chazaras Hashatz. I don't understand. Yalav Yavai, when it's Rish Chodesh, they don't do that. They don't look to say the Yalav Yavai and Chazaras Hashatz. Why, when it comes, I even think on Chol Hamoed of Pesach and Sukkot, they do a Hilchos Shmona Esrei. So then why, when it comes to Chanukah, do they say the full Shmona Esrei and Chazaras Hashatz in order to be able to say al hanisim? What's the reason? Maybe because of Pesume Nisa, and therefore the halacha is different. I think there's a tremendous depth to this halacha. Rashi says that the halacha of Pesume Nisa, the halacha of Kavu v'asim yontif b'hal voidoh, Rashi says al hanisim was part of the takana. They made a yontif to say halal and to say al hanisim. Rashi, that's Rashi. The Rambam never brings al hanisim in Hilchos Chanukah. The Rambam says it's a halacha like Yalav Yavai. It's a halacha of tefillah, and therefore the Rambam only mentions in Hilchos tefillah. Rashi holds al hanisim is not a halacha in tefillah. It's a halacha in takone, that it becomes the yontiv of Chanukah through saying al hanisim. Al hanisim is a kiyum of Chanukah. It's not a kiyum of tefillah. Im Kain, I understand the minig of Lakewood. The minig of Lakewood is like Rashi, not like the Rambam. Rashi holds saying al hanisim is a kiyum of Chanukah. The more times I can say al hanisim, the more Chanukah I have. According to the Rambam, it's a din in Hilchos Tefillah. If in Hilchos Tefillah I don't have to say Chazaras Hashatz, so I don't have to say al hanisim. That's going to be the pshat, I think, in the minig of the yeshivas, that on Chanukah, possibly on Purim, I'm not sure about Purim, we'll have to revisit that at Purim time. That would be the halach. But now let's go back to our original piece. The Shitas HaRambam is you light b'tchila shkia, and according to the it means light b'tchila shkia. According to the Mechaber, you light it b'soif shkia. We began the shia with a question. According to the Rambam, well, how could you light Ner Chanukah when it's b'tchila shkia? It's still not the day of Chanukah, and therefore it's not the day of Chanukah. I like to strengthen the kasha now when I go on to a little bit of a different teretz of why the Rambam holds that way. There's a big mavucha question in all the Mefarshim if the Shitas HaRambam is like the Shita of Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam holds that Shkia is, I don't want to get into any controversy right now, but in the times, in the Hungarian and Hasidic places in Europe, they would do malacha of Shabbos after sunset, because they held all the way like Rabbeinu Tam, that Rabbeinu Tam holds Laila begins by Soif Shkia at around 54 minutes after Shkia or 45 minutes after Shkia. That's when it begins. There's a whole historical factors that the Rambam tells us that the historical factors tell us that there was some sort of a pact made between Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zechat Tzaddik Levroch, and the Satmarov, that the Satmarov accepted for his Kehila that they won't do Malach after Shabbos. But according to Rabbeinu Tam, it's completely legal, Meitchila Shkia, from the beginning of the sunset to do Malacha, because it's nothing, it's Vada Yoim until the Seif Shkia, what we call Seif Shkia, which Rabbeinu Tam would even hold as Tchila Shkia. It seems to be in many Mefarshim that the Rambam agrees to that sheet. And the Rambam holds like Rabbeinu Tam. So that even strengthens our question. Would the Rambam hold me Tchilas Shkia would mean Mamish Shkia, like Tchilas Shkia of when the sun sets? It's completely Yom. It has nothing to do with Laila. And still you would light the Ner Chanukah. But I want to say something very, very simple. When did the Rambam light Erev Shabbos? The Rambam says on the 8 days of Chanukah, you're madlik the menorah im shkiyasa, loy ma'achrin v'loy magdimen. We're conditioned that on Friday we light it 18 minutes or more before shkia, because there's no choice. You can't light it by shkia because it's too late. By lighting it by shkia, will be Machal Shabbos. Ner Chanukah is not Doich Shabbos, so therefore you can't light it. So we know that there's a halacha you could light Ner Chanukah even from Plag HaMincha. So it was baked into the takon of Chanukah to light Ner Chanukah on Friday from Plag HaMincha. The Rambam never mentions the option of lighting Ner Chanukah from Plag HaMincha. It's not mentioned in the Rambam. And the Rambam tells us 8 days of Chanukah you light im shkiyasa, loy ma'achrin, v'loy magdimen. How could the Rambam tell us that? Every 8 days of Chanukah invariably have a Shabbos. When did the Rambam light Ner Chanukah Erev Shabbos? And there's a tremendous hashmota, an omission of the Rambam. He doesn't mention the halacha Plag HaMincha. That's in Shulchan Aruch. But the Rambam never has halacha Plag HaMincha. When did the Rambam light on Erev Shabbos? This is a great question. When did the Rambam light on Erev Shabbos? V'hanira loymar, that the Rambam held, he lit with shkia. You know why? Because the Rambam held like Rabbeinu Tam. And he held Shabbos doesn't start until much later. And Ner Chanukah we always do with shkia. So you could do on Friday what you do on Tuesday. And it's all equal because you could light Ner Chanukah from shkia. And shkia is not Shabbos. This is great news. I'm not saying this is what we do because we're machmer on shkia. But according to the Rambam, he's staying strictly to the rules of Shabbos. The Rambam says, you're madlik im shkiyasa, loy ma'achrin v'loy magdimen. And that's what you would do on Friday too. So we see that underlines our fact that the Rambam holds that when you're lighting the Ner Chanukah, you're lighting the Ner Chanukah before it is Chanukah, because you're lighting it when it's completely Chav Dalet Kislev. So come out of Gewaldige Chiddush in the Rambam. When the first day of Chanukah is Shabbos, and you're lighting it on Chav Dalet Kislev, and you're being makabel Chanukah early, it's a very lumdisha thing. You're being makabel Chanukah early, but you're not being makabel Shabbos early. So you're going to split it. You're makabel the Chanukah of Chafei Kislev. It's not Chafei Kislev, and it's not Shabbos. So it'll be the Yontiv of Chanukah, independent from the day of Shabbos. So this would have tremendous ramifications on many halachas of Kabbalah's Tosefes Shabbos. So I just want to at this point go over the cheshbon of the shir. We began the shir with a machlokes, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, When do you light Neres Chanukah? The Rambam learns it's Tchilas Shkia, according to the reading of Roiv Mefarshim. And he was medayik it from the words of Mishatishka Achama. According to the Rambam, it's Mishatishka Achama. According to Tchilas Shkia. The Mechaber notes the Rambam, but he adds the words Ad Soif Shkia also. So you have to wait till Soif Shkia. What compelled the Mechaber to argue on the Rambam? He said, L'chayra, the Rambam held it's Tchilas Shkia. The Mechaber was bothered by, how could you say Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah, the first day of Chanukah? It's not Chanukah at Tchilas Shkia, because it doesn't become Laila till Soif Shkia. Therefore, that compelled the Mechaber to argue on the Rambam and learn it Soif Shkia. So then what did the Rambam learn? Al Karchach, we spoke out, Rashi leaves out in the Gemara, when they were Kaveh, the Yontiv of Chanukah, it's Bahalul V'hoidah, for Halal and saying Al Anisa. However, Rashi leaves out Hadlakas Ner Chanukah. The Rambam puts in Hadlakas Ner Chanukah. If the Rambam puts in Hadlakas Ner Chanukah and Rashi doesn't, there must be a fitting reason why Rashi leaves out Ner Chanukah and the Rambam puts it in. We spoke out the Gemara Masechtas Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis, where the Gemara talks about Botla Yomim Tovim D'Rabbanan from Megillas Tainis. The Gemara brings a very far out raya from Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Yeshua that the Yontiv of Chanukah was not bottled because they didn't want to fast on Chanukah. Freik Tosfos is a Perish Mishnah. They sent the Shluchim out for Chanukah. Tosfos answers because the Shluchim was sent out for Hadlakas Neres, even if the Yontiv would become bottled, but in Hadlakas Neres would not become bottled. Said the Rashba argues, and the Rashba says if the Yontif would become bottled, the Hadlakas Neres would also come bottled. Nearer that it's a machlokes is Hadlakas Neres, an independent and distinct part of Chanukah that takes place on Chofei Kislev 8 days, or is it part and parcel of the Yontif of Chanukah? Rashi and Tosfos hold it's separate and distinct, and Rashba holds it's part of the Yontif. If it would have been bottled the Yontif, it would have been bottled Hadlakas Neres. We would venture a thought to say that's why Rashi leaves it out in Masechtas Shabbos, because the Gemara in Masechtas Shabbos talking about Kavu v'asu Yontif. Yontif is Yontif. Yontif is only Halal and Haidah. Doesn't talk about Hadlakas Neres, because Rashi holds like Tosfos Masechtas Rosh Hashanah. Now Hadlakas Neres is not part of the Yontif. Therefore, Rashi doesn't mention it. The Rambam who does mention it, the Rambam holds Hadlakas Neres is a part of the Metzias of the Yontif. If it's part of the Metzias of the Yontif, therefore the halacha would be that it would be part of the Imkain. If someone, we spoke out a question of Tosefos Shabbos, if someone's getting bar mitzvah Chaf Sivan and he makes an early Shabbos on Chaf Sivan, when Shabbos is Chaf Sivan, does he become a gadol? The Pashto says he doesn't become a gadol because it doesn't become that doesn't become a gadol until it becomes Vaday Laila. However, it does become the Yontif. It does become the Shabbos. So too by Chanukah. If you make Chanukah early, it becomes Chanukah, but it doesn't become Chafei Kislev. Or it doesn't become Chafei Kislev. So then the halacha would be, if it doesn't become Chafei Kislev, so the halacha would be, according to Rashi, you would not be able to light Neres Chanukah, because Neres Chanukah are tied very tightly to the calendar date of Chafei Kislev. According to the Rambam, it's Chanukah, and once it's the Yontif of Chanukah, it's connected to the Neres of Chanukah. Therefore, the Rambam had the liberty to learn it begins by Shkia. However, according to the Rambam, according to Rashi, it did not begin that way, and therefore we said there's nafkamina. There would be a nafkamina al anisim, and there would be a nafkamina about Friday. According to the Rambam, there's never a hechrich that you could light from Plag HaMincha. The only reason we know you could light from Plag HaMincha is because of the halacha of there's a new mechanism of Plag HaMincha, because you really should light Vaday Laila. Instead, you say light it early, so you can light it from Plag HaMincha. According to the Rambam, there's no hechrich, because you always light Mitchila Shkia. If you light Mitchila Shkia, there's no such halacha. There's other terutzim I have on this inyan. Maybe you have a different one. Just finish off with one thing, B'derech Drush. Then at the end, maybe one small shaila that I want to throw out to the Olam in Lundis. Many, many years ago, I was zeicha to be at the Hadlakas Neres Chanukah by the Amshon of a Rebbe in Bayit Vagan, very late at night, Amshon of a Rebbe Shlita. Anybody who witnessed it, it could be etched in your memory. It's something to see, the Avodas HaKodesh of this great tzaddik, the Amshon of a Rebbe Shlita. And I was there, and it was late at night, and the Rebbe asked the famous kasha after Hadlakas Neres. And he asked, what would the Beis Yosef's kasha, Why do we need 8 days of Chanukah? L'chaira, the first day was not an S. I'm the most famous question that was zeicha to be the question of all of Klal Yisrael. Why do we need 8 days? The first day was not an S. There was enough oil for the first day. And the Amron Rebbe said, really, he didn't say it in this way, but I'll say it in a very strong way. And the Amron Rebbe said, if someone celebrates and thanks Hashem for Nes and doesn't thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Teva, it almost borders on apikorsis. Because a person who thanks Hashem for Nes means he doesn't really need Hashem when it comes to the Teva. The only reason we make a big celebration about Nes is to spark us, to make us think, to focus us, to be able to see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always there, and I'll call Neshima, every step of the way, we can't live without HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He said that the Pasuk says in Parshas B'Shalach, when Klal Yisrael went into the Yam Suf, Uvnei Yisrael holchu bayom b'soich hayabosha. Then later on in the Psukim, as they were in the Yam Suf, it says, they went by Yabosha b'soich hayom. So the Noam Elimelech says, why does it begin by saying as hayom b'soich hayabosha, and then say by Yabosha b'soich hayom? So the Noam Elimelech, when they went into the Yam Suf, they felt the great strength and the great kedusha and the power of the Eibishter. They were walking in a yam, and they gave hoidah to the Eibishter. But everybody has to grow and steig. And while we're in the Yam Suf, they steiged and they grew to a point when they understood every time you walk on Yabosha, you're walking b'toich hayam. Walking out of your house is a kriyas Yam Suf, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is allowing you to walk out of your house. So they grew and steig to the matziv of Bayabosha b'soich hayam. Tamshon Rebbe said, therefore, that's what the first day of Chanukah is. The first day of Chanukah is there was no Nes, but we're celebrating the Nes of no Nes. And we're being magdim. That's what Chanukah is about. We're celebrating the 8 days by what it burned 7 days and what we mischievously think, and we're in a false way thinking that the first day is not a Nes. And then he touched and he said, in the Mois Sur we say, B'nei Vina Yemei Shmoina. B'nei Vina, Bina is Maven Davar, Mitoich Davar. If you derive one thing from another thing, that's intelligence. That's Bina. B'nei Vina, those who can derive B from A is Yemei Shmoina. They can answer the Beis Yosef's kasha of why it's 8 days. Because they know it's 8 days. It's not enough to celebrate Nes. You have to celebrate the not Nes. Ma Nema Basrei. What could we say in today's times when we have to train ourselves to appreciate the normal? The normal is Nes. How much did we take for granted the normal? And now we're coming to the Yemei Chanukah. We have to strengthen ourselves in our Amunah. Now you don't have to be such a big lamdan to know B'nei Vina is Yemei Shmoina. That you don't have to even be a Graisa Maven and a big intellectual to be able to figure out that the Teva is also Nes. It's in our hands. The Eibishter is showing it to us in such a strong, clear, with clarity, that that's what the B'nei Vina and the Yemei Shmoina is. Finish with a Maisa. The first Vorka Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak Vorka, Zeichet Tzadik Lebrocha, Schusa Yogan Aleinu, was always Isaac in Pidyon Shvuyim. And when he was Isaac in Pidyon Shvuyim, he used to be in Warsaw. He lived in Vorka, but he used to be in Warsaw, speaking to the government, collecting money for Pidyon Shvuyim and Father Tzrachim. One night of Chanukah, he was in Warsaw, and he was staying as an achsanya in the home of the Chedushay Harim. His friend, the Chedushay Harim, they were both Talmidim of the Rebbe Rabbinim. So therefore, the Rebbe Rabbinim, he stayed by his friend, the Chadushei Harim, and the Chadushei Harim went, and he came home late, and the Rabbi Yitzchak Vorka came home late, and he was getting ready late at night to light the Ner Chanukah. The Chadushei Harim, in his characteristic sharp way, said to the Rabbi Yitzchak Vorka, "Azoi shveit Ner Chanukah." So late, Ner Chanukah. So Rabbi Yitzchak Vorka turned to him and he said, Misha Omar l'shemen lihadlik, the famous Gemara, whoever tells shemen to light, hu omer l'choimitz lihadlik, he could tell vinegar to light. And then the Rabbi Yitzchak Vorka said, choimitz is me'loshin mitzvah haba liyotcha al tachmitzenu. Don't be late to do a mitzvah. He said, Chaimitz also means late. Misha Omer l'shemen liyadlik. The same Eibishter who accepts when you light a shemen as a mitzvah's Chanukah. Yoimar l'chaimitz liyadlik. Even someone who's coming late to the game, the Eibishter will accept his hadlokas ner Chanukah. Misha Omer l'shemen liyadlik. Yoimar l'chaimitz liyadlik. Even to the latecomers, the Eibishter is also there for them. This Vasema says in Chanukah, Psilas u'shmonim she'ein madlikim behem b'Shabbos, madlikim behem b'Chanukah. Everybody has an achiz in Chanukah. Even the Psilas u'shmonim, which symbolize people who are not always perfect, who are not always muksher to be close to the Eibishter. When it comes to Chanukah, they have this feeling of closeness. B'nei Vina. This Chanukah, we're all B'nei Vina. Even if we're late to the game, even if we never felt this closeness with the Eibishter, we never felt in the day-to-day, in the Neshima, and Psiya with the Eibishter. Now we feel it. This Chanukah is Yoimar L'choimitz Liyadlik. The Eibishter saying to us, we're the latecomers, but the latecomers are the Psilas U'Shmonim, Shein Madlikim B'hem B'Shabbos, Madlikim B'hem B'Chanukah. Let's all, the oyer of the Chanukah, the oyer of the mitzvahs, the oyer that the Mipnei Chachomim Sheba'osei Hadoyer, that was the last door that made these kind of takonas, that talks to us in this Ikvus of the Mashiach. The Eibshter should help all of us. B'schus HaTorah, b'schus the mitzvahs, b'schus Aviseinu, b'schus our Amunah, b'schus the Amunah of Aviseinu. We should all be Zeicha Bez Hashem, to have the Shmira and the Hagonah, and the Eibishter will help all of us. And we should be able to keep getting together, B'Shavas Tach Kemoini, together, Gesundheit,